It is Saturday now, April 12, 2025. I am reading more news reports trying to understand the ongoing efforts to end the war in Ukraine, as described in this hypothetical Trump 2.0 timeline. This latest article focuses directly on President Trump's recent statements and actions, and a significant meeting between his envoy and Russian President Putin. The report highlights President Trump's public message from yesterday, Friday, April 11th. He apparently posted on his social media platform, Truth Social, demanding that Russia must act to stop the conflict. He called the war terrible and senseless, mourning the thousands killed each week, and repeated his claim that the war never would have started if he had been president earlier. However, the report notes that Trump didn't publicly specify what actions Russia should take. He has repeatedly said he wants a ceasefire and that the U.S. is negotiating. "I don't like the bombings," he reportedly added. But behind the public calls, the article suggests the Trump administration is using strong pressure tactics. It cites an Axios report from yesterday claiming Trump might impose more sanctions on Russia if a ceasefire deal isn't reached by the end of this month, April. The report also mentions Trump himself warning that if a peace deal fails, he would impose secondary tariffs on Russian oil imports. There's also pressure, reportedly directed at Ukraine. The article mentions Trump warning Ukraine's President, Zelensky, that he could face big problems if he doesn't sign some kind of critical mineral deal with the United States. Reading this, I think, this sounds complicated. Is the U.S. acting as a neutral mediator? Or is it pushing both sides hard, using threats of sanctions against Russia and linking unrelated issues like a mineral deal to pressure Ukraine? The report confirms the high-level meeting between U.S. envoy Steve Witkoff and President Putin happened yesterday in St. Petersburg. It apparently lasted about 4 hours. The official statement from the Kremlin was brief and vague, saying only that they discussed aspects of a solution for the Ukraine conflict. The Russian envoy, who was also present, Kirill Dmitriev, described the talks as effective, but no real details were given. However, the article includes a potentially explosive piece of information from a source cited by the Kyiv Independent news outlet. This source claimed that envoy Witkoff had advised President Trump that the quickest way to get a ceasefire would be to grant Russia ownership of the 4 Ukrainian regions: Moscow annexed, Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson, and Zaporizhzhia. I pause to consider this reported leak. If that's true, I think, it seems to contradict Trump's public stance, blaming Russia and calling the war senseless. Publicly, the message is tough on Russia. But this leak suggests that privately, the advice might be to give Russia much of what it wants territorially, just to stop the fighting quickly. That would be a huge concession. The report reminds readers of the difficult background. Russia has refused the full 30-day ceasefire proposed by the U.S., which Ukraine accepted back in March. If Russia also agreed, Moscow insists that any long-term peace requires Kyiv to give up NATO ambitions and recognize Russian control over Crimea and the 4 other regions. The U.S. position, according to officials cited, is that both sides need to make concessions. The report also mentions Trump's apparent frustration with both leaders. Back in March, he was reportedly unhappy with both Putin and Zelensky for delaying a ceasefire deal. He was also reportedly very angry with Putin for trying to undermine Zelensky's legitimacy, with Trump apparently rejecting Putin's premise that Zelensky was no longer the legitimate president. Yet, Trump also reportedly believes both leaders are ready for a peace deal and trusts the U.S. mediation effort. Thinking about all this, the approach described seems full of contradictions. Trump publicly calls for Russia to act, laments the killing, expresses anger at Putin, yet his envoy reportedly suggests conceding Ukrainian territory. He pressures Russia with sanctions, threats, but also pressures Ukraine by tying peace efforts to a mineral deal. He believes they are ready for peace, yet expresses frustration at their delays. Is this a coherent strategy, I wonder? Or is it a highly personalized, deal-driven approach focused on getting a result? Any result, quickly, even if it means using tactics that seem contradictory or involve controversial compromises. The reported leak about ceding territory is particularly troubling if true. Would that lead to a stable peace, or just reward aggression? And how reliable is that leak? It's attributed to one source, but it dramatically changes the perception of the U.S. negotiation strategy described here. I finished reading late on Saturday. This report adds layers of complexity and apparent contradictions to the picture of the Trump administration's push to end the Ukraine war in this hypothetical scenario. The mix of public demands, private pressures, high-level meetings with vague outcomes, and that potentially explosive leak about territorial concessions makes it very difficult to understand the true direction or likely success of the peace efforts described. It paints a picture of a high-stakes, unpredictable diplomatic process. It is Saturday evening now, April 12, 2025. The news reports I am reading have shifted focus again. This latest article discusses concerns coming from the head of the NATO military alliance, Secretary General Mark Rutte. The concerns are serious. They are about potential threats originating not on Earth, but in outer space, and they specifically mention Russia. The main point of the report is a warning from Mr. Rutte. He stated that NATO is worried Russia might be considering the possibility of putting nuclear weapons into space. He called this idea alarming. The specific fear described is that Russia could, perhaps in the future, use nuclear weapons deployed in space to attack satellites. Interestingly, the report also includes Mr. Rutte's assessment that Russia's current space technology capabilities are actually lagging behind those of Western countries. He suggested that maybe Russia is thinking about space-based nuclear weapons as a way to enhance its capabilities, perhaps to try and level the playing field, because they are behind in other areas of space tech. Mr. Rutte also emphasized, according to the report, that putting nuclear weapons in orbit would be a clear violation of the Outer Space Treaty from 1967. That's a major international agreement, started by the US and the Soviet Union during the Cold War, meant to keep space peaceful and ban weapons of mass destruction there. The report adds that Russia has not yet commented on these accusations from NATO. Reading this tonight, several questions come to my mind. Nuclear weapons in space. That sounds incredibly dangerous, like something out of science fiction, I think. How real is this possibility? Mr. Rutte calls it alarming, which sounds serious. But he also says Russia is currently lagging behind in space technology. So, is this an immediate danger, something Russia can do now? Or is it more of a future worry, something Russia might try to develop because they feel they are behind? The report mentions NATO is aware of reports suggesting Russia is considering this. But how solid is that intelligence? It is hard for an ordinary reader to know. And what if Russia did decide to break the 1967 treaty? Can international law actually stop a major world power if it is determined to do something like this? Highlighting the treaty violation seems important, maybe as a way to pressure Russia publicly, but would it be enough? The report explains that NATO countries are not just worrying, they are taking action because of these concerns and because space, in general, is becoming more complex. They are adjusting their space strategies. They are sharing more intelligence information among allies. Countries are setting up special space command units within their own militaries. They are also working on developing new types of satellites, maybe smaller, harder to track, and better protected against attack. As Mr. Rutte stated, space is a key factor in NATO's deterrence and defense. The report also touches on the bigger picture. Mr. Rutte noted that space itself is becoming more crowded, dangerous, and unpredictable. It is not just about one country. Competition is heating up globally. The article mentions that France's defense minister recently called the space industry a potential weak point for his military, and an EU official apparently called for creating a unified European space shield to coordinate defense efforts in space. So, it seems the specific concern about Russia possibly putting nuclear weapons in space is part of a larger trend. Space is no longer just for exploration or communication satellites. It is increasingly seen as a potential arena for conflict. NATO and European countries seem to be waking up to this reality and realizing they need stronger defenses and strategies for space. Finally, the report connects these space concerns to the Arctic. Mr. Rutte announced NATO plans to use satellites much more to monitor the Arctic region. Why? Because NATO is worried that Russia is increasingly militarizing the Arctic and taking advantage of new sea routes opening up as the ice melts due to climate change. NATO apparently sees the Arctic as a new front for competition with Russia. Satellites are crucial for watching what happens on the land and sea there, and for providing secure communications for NATO forces. Linking the Arctic surveillance to the space weapon concerns suggests NATO might see Russia's actions in both areas as part of a connected challenge. I finished reading the article late on Saturday evening. It raises some unsettling possibilities about the future weaponization of space, specifically mentioning NATO's concerns about Russia. While the report leaves questions about how immediate or capable this specific Russian threat might be, the concerns are clearly driving NATO to adapt. They are developing new space strategies, new technologies, and increasing surveillance, especially in other contested areas like the Arctic. It really shows how international security challenges are expanding into new domains, demanding constant vigilance and adaptation from nations and alliances, even when dealing with threats that might still be developing or hard to fully confirm.